Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from this evening in London time. Today marks a special day for CDSB. Today we're releasing the Biodiversity Application Guidance, and this work concludes a series of application guidance to the CDSB framework. The aim of the climate, water, and now biodiversity guidance documents is to support companies in disclosing nature-related information with the same rigor as financial information, and answer those really tough questions we get in the Secretariat every day in CDSB, which is, how do I do it and what does it look like? Whilst there has been a lot of progress in understanding climate-related risks, a lot more needs to be done to meet the goals of Paris and keeping us to 1.5 degrees global warming. But significantly more needs to be done to account for nature-related risks. The recent floods and droughts and the dramatic decline of species they're witnessing is a fact that no one can afford to ignore. It is imperative that we see these issues as interconnected and acknowledge that they're links to people as well. Everyone has a role to play in tackling these issues, and ultimately, we need to make sure that the capital is allocated towards sustainable and resilient businesses. For this to happen, companies must provide consistent, comparable, decision-useful and reliable information to investors. So why are we releasing biodiversity guidance now? In time, the ISSB intends to cover all sustainability topics, and we are starting with climate, but we won't stop there. This guidance will not only inform future standards, but can be used to provide the information investors need now. The guidance provides a disclosure checklist, tools, examples of reporting that are aligned with the TCFD and other standards. It also looks at biodiversity through the lens of dynamic materiality, where a sustainability matter such as biodiversity can become financially material either gradually or very, very quickly. So right now, just in case you want something to read while we're hearing all of these great panelists speak, go online and you can download it from www.cdsb.net/biodiversity. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our fabulous panel of speakers today. We are absolutely delighted at CDSB to welcome Nandini Kumar, from the CEO of the World Federation of Exchanges. Thank you, and we're really looking forward to hearing some of your perspectives from the exchange and also of issuers trying to do some of what we're going to be talking about today. A very fabulous old friend and a key supporter of CDSB's work over many, many, many years. I'm delighted to welcome Mark Goff, CEO of the Capitals Coalition, as well as my rock star colleague and technical director at CDSB, Ravi Abhivardhana, who'll bring some of his perspectives from life before CDSB, as well as that of a standard setter. Will then be followed by a presentation by my colleagues who have led and developed this work themselves. So Laura Clavey and Francesca Ricanti, our technical managers at CDSB. We'll have questions and answers throughout, so I'll try and weave them in. So please do pop them in the chat as they're going along. If you've got anything, we'll try and address them either in writing or as part of my questions, and panelists might pick them up as well. So do keep sending them through. So our topic of discussion today is about biodiversity-related risks and why it's so important that companies measure and manage them. So to kick us off today, I'm delighted to share a pre-recorded message from our earlier session today from Professor Partha Dasgupta, who recently published the report, The Economics of Biodiversity, who really did set the record straight for us on the value of nature for our economy. And he brought up some brilliant insights this morning around ecosystems and trust. So I hope you enjoy the keynote now, and then we'll move on to our panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me still. Okay, good. The review that you just mentioned, the review of the economics of biodiversity, which was submitted to the Treasury early February, is in some deep sense not really about biodiversity. It's about ecosystems, pieces of natural capital, which can be as small as the gut of an animal and as large as the open oceans. These are assets, these are stocks, and Mother Nature is furnishing us, not intending to. We're nowhere in her mind, but she's furnishing us with a plethora of services, goods and services, one of which, of course, is climate regulation, which you alluded to, Madi, a few minutes ago. But the others, which get overlooked or have been overlooked, are really very deep and often unobservable and unhearable, inaudible, that is, which would be cleaning up the mess, decomposing waste, that is, pollination, nitrogen fixation, natural cleansing of water, and so forth. So there's a huge range of services we enjoy, which enables us to pluck out of nature goods and services which we then use to produce physical capital, like roads, buildings, the desk you're sitting at, and so forth, and human capital, education, health. These two latter classes of capital are bread and butter for companies. And not just companies, but government models of the economy and academic models as well. And they have dominated our understanding of economic possibilities. But of course, it has meant that we have misunderstood them, because one absolutely primary set of assets, which are ecosystems, have been missing. Now, one aspect of nature is that she's very mobile. She moves, which means what you do at one spot, one particular place, can have consequences, and usually does have consequences, far away and sometime in the distant future. Climate regulation as being affected by carbon emissions is a very good example of that. And I don't have to rehearse that fact. But it means that property rights are very hard to establish. It's easy to have a property rights on a desk because it's sitting there and you can grab it, claim it, and use it. Can't do that when it sort of moves, the wind moves or the ocean currents flow and so forth. Which means, of course, that much of nature remains unpriced in the marketplace, which is why you are now concerned about it. Because there's what has happened is that the process of economic development over the past 70 years in particular has put an incredible pressure on Mother Nature at the expense, and we've used it, overused it to produce physical capital, produce capital and human capital. So that's the background. So when I said that it's not so much biodiversity, but rather the ecosystems, I meant that what we're really interested in is viewing ecosystems as capital assets and trying to measure and appreciate their productivity. And when I say productivity, I mean it in exactly the same way as you talk about productivity of a desk or a building or whatever. And when you decide on investing in a roadwork or a building or factory or you name it, you look for this productivity and do some form of cost-benefit analysis, estimating the rate of return on an investment in that. And the language of my review is no different. I'm an economist by training, and I've stuck very closely to economic reasoning. The only complaint I have about the way of the previous economics prior to the review, the informed economics of growth and development and poverty, is that it was misusing economics. It wasn't that economics was at fault. We had the reasoning already. Okay, so that's the background. So why are we interested in biodiversity? Biodiversity is a feature, a characteristic of ecosystems. If you have a pond or a lake or a forest or a wetland or a mangrove forest or whatever, those are capital assets, okay? With, depending on its range, it could be small or large, and have processes guiding it, driving them, which may be very slow. Some of them are very fast, and so forth, okay? But you're interested in the productivity, and one of the findings of ecologists of recent decades has been that biodiversity, when conceived in a generous way, if you like, not simply head count of species, but something deeper. And I don't have time here to discuss what I mean by deeper, but just let's use the word biodiversity, contributes positively to the productivity of ecosystems. So it's almost like saying, look, this society functions well because people trust one another. The society is not, trust is not the society. Trust is a characteristic of people, interpersonal relationships, if you like. But if there is trust, it's the society itself functions better. So think of that as an imagery. Okay, so that's why we are interested in biodiversity. In my review, I don't even bother about measuring biodiversity because I'm interested in measuring the productivity of ecosystems, and that can be done, and that has been done by many, many people. And one of the things I think firms ought to do now, particularly if you're interested in this area, which you should be, because it affects your bottom line, as they say, you ought to be hiring ecologists to work with economists. All right, so that's the background. Now, biodiversity connects with other environmental issues, a question that you raised in your notes to me before when we were discussing this topic. It's connected to other these services, including climate change, because the services that Mother Nature offers us are not just one, they're all over the place, as I mentioned, and they're complementary to one another. That's a key thing. They're complementary in the sense if you drive down one very heavily, then the others are affected adversely. As you can see from the connection between biodiversity loss and climate change. If you wipe out the rainforest, tropical rainforest, a great deal of biodiversity will be lost. But of course, at the same time, your climate is going to be hugely affected. Climate change, on the other hand, is going to change the distribution of biota, quite apart from many other things that happen, okay? Including, for example, the wind system and so forth. So these are all interrelated, that's for sure. Now, what do institutions have to offer, given that markets malfunction? The other question that you sent me to pay attention to in my talk was, what role do organizations have in reversing and preventing loss of biodiversity? And of course, I'm taking it for granted that you all know that at the moment, we're losing biodiversity in a big way and have been so for quite some time. Estimates abound, and I won't bother you with it. It's a really serious problem. And a symptom of that is the weakening of the productivity of some of the major ecosystems of the world. Climate change is, of course, one version of it. But the productivity of wetlands, of a variety of wetlands, the loss in productivity of the oceans as we dump garbage into it, as it has to absorb so much more carbon than it used to, is acidifying and so forth. So we're looking at the loss in productivity, and that's something that you should be concerned with. Now, when you asked about institutions, of course, there are households, firms, communities, governments, and of course, the international sphere. These are all institutions. The UN is an institution as well. And each needs to be involved in it for the simple reason that the range over which these services, nature services, cover is huge. Some of them will be at the household level, your plot of your garden, your backyard garden. That has biodiversity and is extremely important for your life. It's good for your health, it's good for many things. And of course, it's connected to other people's gardens and so on, okay? So now I'm not going to work through each of the tasks, households, communities, but I'll speak a little bit about firms and then I'll close down, okay? And then we can have a discussion. Biodiversity matters to companies because, apart from anything else, it's one of the assets that you're working with. It's as simple as that. It may not come into your ledger, but that's only because there's no financial statement about it. You're not buying it from the market necessarily, but now I will talk about those where you do buy from the market. You're a company which is importing primary products from, let us say, Africa. And there's a long supply chain at the end of which you produce something which is sold in the supermarkets of the UK. And I'm the consumer, okay? Now in that supply chain, there are many things happening. One of them being that many of their actions are not observable. So there's moral hazard. In addition to the fact that many of the primary products that you buy are part of ecosystems, maybe coffee beans or whatever. Okay, you name the product. It'll be from ecosystems. Now, the market failure that I mentioned to begin with is operating there. And excessive use of that, particularly if the importing company is not particularly concerned about or doesn't have an understanding of the ecosystems which are supplying the primary products, there'll be additional pressure on it, namely, and which will then mean the supply chain is threatened or weakened, raising the risk on the profits that you're making. So, that's one reason you should be concerned with. I mean, when I say the risk, that may be the first thing that you observe. But of course, the average productivity would be declining too, and that will threaten your own profits. Now, in the old days of old, you might say, well, it doesn't matter if this sort of supply source goes under because the ecosystem has collapsed or near collapse. I can move elsewhere. The problem is a crowded earth at the moment. So that's not going to be that easy. Okay, so you need in some ways to protect it just the way you protect your own factory, because it's the source of your supply. Now, here's the problem. Well, here's another problem. These risks are correlated across firms, positively correlated firms, because your rival company is also buying the primary product from a neighboring ecosystem back in Africa or wherever. I'm just giving you a metaphor, giving you a storyline. Okay. Given that, the positive correlation means what? It means that it is not easy for you to get insurance against the risk that you're facing, increased risk that you're facing. And if you can't get that, then we have a problem that you really need to invest in your own ecosystem. But the problem is your own incentive to invest in the ecosystem from which you're deriving your primary product is related to the risk that another company is facing. So the decline in the productivity of rival sources is affecting your own. And so in a sense, individual action, individual company action is not going to be enough. You need collective action across the companies, even if they're rivals. Because it's a standard game theoretic problem of the prisoner's dilemma sort. You've got a failed market. You've got correlated risks. You can both do better if you work together. One way of doing that would be to ensure that you disclose your supply chain, the characteristics of your supply chain. The same way as companies who produce food have to disclose the content of the food these days, because citizens, customers insist on knowing what they're eating. Likewise, to the extent that citizens are going to get more and more concerned about nature, they're going to be asking, how are you behaving with regard to Mother Nature? It may be far away from us, but we care. We care about the rainforest, we care about the mangrove forests which are being destroyed, or whatever, the fisheries that are being degraded. So there is a need now for collective action to be in the interest of companies to insist on disclosure, because disclosure is going to keep firms honest. And it's in the interest of the firms to be honest because of this collective hazard. So that's the chain of reasoning that that sort of lends itself to this problem, whereby it is in the interest of companies to ask governments to require that companies disclose their supply chain, the conditions of their supply chain. And this disclosure is a substitute for missing markets, for missing prices. So prices are not the only way of transmitting information about the scarcity of resources. Quantities can do the same thing, and characteristic of what we are doing to in our supply chain. That information can be very, very valuable. It's in the interest of the customers, it's in the interest of the firms. But at the end of the day, what my review does is, in fact, I wrote the review not for companies, not even for the UK Treasury, even though they asked me to produce it, but I wrote the entire review, that all 600 pages were written for the citizen. Because at the end of the day, it will be we, citizens. Companies, you may think of us as customers, but I think of us as citizens, because our role is more than just going to the supermarket, is we have to exert pressure at every level of organization, our communities, our own selves, communities, companies, the government, and more extensively, and today with the networks that we have through the internet, we really can exert pressure on the United Nations as well in tackling these problems at their various levels in a way which enables us to survive as a species in a reasonable state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I'm now going to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and let's jump right into the topic at hand. So I'm going to start with Nandini. Welcome. What role, we've just heard a bit about the UN, the role that each and every sort of layer has to play if we're really going to achieve what we need to achieve on all of ecosystem restoration. What role can exchanges play with regard to supporting consistent, comparable and reliable information on biodiversity to the market?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And may I start by saying how much we commend as an industry the work that you are doing around biodiversity and related subjects, because we think it's an important area and one that hasn't really yet come into its own. We've had so much focus on climate, and I think all of us recognize that, you know, biodiversity comes, you know, hand in hand with that, and indeed needs to be the next frontier, if you like, in many ways that we as an industry must tackle. So I think your question was great. It was very specific. It said, you know, what role can exchanges play? We are, as an industry, and WFE represents 300 odd market infrastructures around the world. We are, as an industry, uniquely positioned at the intersection between investors, companies, and regulators. And I try to, when I try to describe our role sometimes to our stakeholders, I say we're at the center of the center. You know, exchange capital markets are at the center, if you like, of solving some of the problems around climate and biodiversity. I think there's clear recognition of that. And exchanges, market infrastructure, not just exchanges, but market infrastructure in general is at the center of that. So the center of the center. We've got kind of a wealth of things we could talk about, but let me give you three topics or three issues that I'd like all of you to think about. I mean, the first of which is, in 2018, we published something called the WFE principles, and they kind of are our sustainability principles which govern the framework and the way that exchanges around the world think about ESG, about in relation both to their stakeholders and to their users, but also to themselves. And one of the key principles here relates to promoting the enhanced availability of ESG information. So that, of course, is the first and the key role that exchanges need and must play. We do an annual sustainability survey. For those of you who are interested, it's on our website. And over 70% of our members said in our last survey that they are now engaging with activities related to promoting the enhanced availability of ESG information. And that's in a variety of ways. You know, they engage stakeholders to advance the sustainable finance agenda. You know, you can issue formal ESG guidance, reporting guidance for listed companies. You know, you offer sustainability related products, etc. I always say that exchanges are in the business of providing solutions. You know, we solve problems, and this is one of the ways we can, you know, solve a problem. Finally, I want to leave you with one thought, and I'm happy to come back and expand on this list, but conscious that we have a number of wonderful panelists to hear from. I think what I want to say is, with all these things, it isn't the exchange alone in isolation. Obviously, disclosure is the key tool through which exchanges, stock exchanges, can tackle some of these issues around biodiversity for listed companies. But I would say to all of you in the audience and on this panel, exchanges don't exist in isolation. We're part of an ecosystem, and it's a good word to use in this conversation. And that ecosystem is mutually interdependent. So if you want more from your exchange, come to us earlier in the process. Come to us and talk to us and tell us what you need from us earlier in the process. And then I think together, probably we will have a better chance at solving some of these problems that we're talking about. But just to close on this one, I mean, biodiversity is a key theme. We think that, 2022 will definitely, it will be the year of biodiversity amid the dark and the gloom that, COVID has brought us for the last 2 years. The ray of light, if you like, for you and for your colleagues has been that there has never been a time that we as a race, understand more profoundly the importance of nature, the importance of climate, the impact on our lives, and how we must act as a race to change and solve some of those problems.
Thank you so much. A lot in that. We're going to come back with some more questions in a second. I'm going to come to Mark next. So, Mark, the Capitals Coalition's work is referenced right across the biodiversity guidance. But just to make it clearer for all of those listening, everyone likes to know how all these things fit together and stack together and work. How can the Capitals approach, supported by yourselves at the Capitals Coalition, be best tailored to support biodiversity reporting?
So, as always, I think CDSB is slightly on the front of the wave here, is leading this work, which is great. And what a great piece to sunset around with this biodiversity great piece of work. So capitals is the idea, as we heard Dasgupta just talking about there, is this idea that how can we really understand those impacts and dependencies and get those into decisions? And most of the work that we've been focusing on in the coalition community has been focusing on those sort of internal decisions that you might make. And we're just getting to that point now where we're having to try and think, well, if we can start to understand it internally about what it might mean to us, how do we then express that to others? And what the CDSB guidance does here is very, very clearly builds on the protocol. It's mentioned many times throughout the work. It builds off that and is very, very clearly related to all of that work that's gone on before. It is now building that next bridge into how do we relate that to investors. And if we look at the investor market and financial institutions, I remember when we launched our finance sector supplement, and we were probably ahead of the curve a little bit too much there. When we launched it, there was no one there. We launched it in Hong Kong in a 2,000-seater, about 30 people. Now is not the same. Now, when you start to look at it, financial institutions are really clambering after this information. And what we've got here in this guidance is very clearly setting out some of those steps that other people have done and putting it into a language that will build that bridge into disclosure. And that's really, really important. Just one more thing on that. We've seen over the last couple of years, there's been over 21 now, in fact, different biodiversity metrics that have been created. Okay, so biodiversity has become after climate has become the next big thing. Everyone's trying to do it. All the foundations are funding it. Everyone's trying to do something in that space now. You look at COP, and that nature positive agenda was very clearly embedded into the COP climate agenda there. That said, we're now bringing that all together through an aligned project. So all of those metrics as well, and that will very clearly build on what you've been able to do here on the guidance and some of these other things that are going on, but we need to consolidate that down. We're at a period of time where we need to consolidate these things in order to move things forward, and the International Sustainability Standards Board is a key tenet in that, which obviously you're going on to.
And we will touch on that a bit later, Mark, but thank you for that. And I think Mark and I were on a panel last week, and unfortunately, you might have all heard this before, but I can't get past the statistic of $760 billion a year that is wasted on financial misalignment in reporting. And that's a 2018 IFAC statistic, if anyone wants to check that. And the work that Mark's doing around Align is hugely important in that, because it's great we're seeing this burst of action, but we need it to be as aligned and consistent terminology as possible, because one, we don't have time to waste for the planet, and that money could be spent on so many better outcomes for society as a whole than actually just reporting. So on the topic of reporting, Ravi, so your background, you sort of, before this, you got your hands dirty and you're actually an accountant, you actually did this stuff rather than just talk about it. And you worked across, not just as an accountant, but you worked across sustainable finance and sustainability as well. How difficult is it to combine these two things?
Really good question. And I think when I first started out on this journey, it was a bit of a scratching of the head moment, because from a high level, it is clear as daylight, you know, for an accountant, that biodiversity risks and opportunities are, you know, material information for investors. You know, you only need to pick up, you know, the Dasgupta review to really understand, all the Stern review before that on the economics of climate, about the importance of these sorts of systems for the, you know, business viability. So, you know, the omission or misstatement or obscuring of this information to investors, you know, it's material. So this is material information for investors to actually inform their decision making. So I think it's very clear from a high level that this is really important. It should flow into your mainstream financial report, and, you know, and the disclosure of such information to investors. But there are challenges, and when I was in business, you know, I worked in the agri-commodity sector, you know, and the loss of bees posed a, you know, a real concern to, you know, for you know, for that business, because it costs, you know, it costs money to actually try and pollinate the plants which they generate revenues from. So it's really important for, you know, for accountants to really, you know, take this into consideration. But there is a gap, you know, and there's a big step change with regards to, you know, trying to consolidate these high level concepts, and that this is material information for investors. But how do they actually go about, you know, doing this and reporting this and disclosing this information to investors in a clear and consistent way? And the application guidance on biodiversity, developed by Laura and Francesco, really led this from the start, and they've done a fantastic job in consolidating all of this in a very short space of time. You know, supports a preparer, such as an accountant or sustainability lead, or wherever you may be, in trying to actually figure out, look, what are the next steps which I should be doing to actually implement this sort of thinking within the organization which you work in. So it's really important that you start now. There is a lot going on at the moment, but this document really does do a very good job of consolidating what's out there, and very importantly, signposting as well. We're not in the process of like reinventing the wheel. We're very good at signposting. So, and we've signposted to the likes of the Capitals Coalition, for example. So, yeah, please do start now, because if you read in between the lines, this sort of disclosure will become mandatory in the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Ravi. And I might come back to you later on how we go about upskilling all of these preparers, because we're talking about, you know, huge amounts of new reporting, new disclosure. You can't just pop an ecologist out of the air and bring them onto your team. You know, I am a qualified forester if everyone's looking for one. And I'm Jack, an environmental scientist. Maybe I got it around the right way, did the science bit first and the accounting bit later. However, all that aside, from an exchange perspective, what can we see, Nandini? What role can the exchanges play in highlighting but also mitigating the risks associated with biodiversity loss that threatens financial stability?
So I think that's a really, really profound question. We've spoken already, and I think, about disclosure and the role of the exchange, the stock exchange, especially in disclosure. And I think people often feel that disclosure is where it ends with an exchange role, and this is the tool that they use. But we have an enormous power, an enormous kind of mitigation role in the role of risk mitigation, and a number of our members are very focused on risk mitigation. And I would say that, especially looking at an issue like biodiversity, risk mitigation is really where it all comes to be. So if you look at some of the announcements that came out of COP, I mean, there were many, but among the most, I mean, profound and interesting was the initial framework of a global carbon market. And I think that that's a classic example, a good example of the kind of risk mitigation role that an exchange can and should play. And it isn't just the exchange alone. You have the CCP, central counterparties, which in the wake of the G20 were tasked with de-risking the financial system. So as we see, people focus more and more on risk, and people are talking a lot about risk. If you look at the central banks, they're all focused on climate risk. And I think that it will not require any persuasion for people to understand, the risk that biodiversity loss brings, or the loss of nature brings to all of us. So you will see really very interesting, innovative solutions and disclosure, and you'll find modeling and very interesting, innovative ideas coming forward around, the role that our industry can play. And I think we're certainly having a lot of conversations now with members around some of their thinking and their approaches in this particular space. Related to that and adjacent to that is something I said earlier, which is that as an industry, we exist to solve problems. So we exist to solve problems that occur in other parts of the ecosystem of the world, because we believe that public markets, markets-based financing is a force for good. And it is the way that we can build a more inclusive society, but also that we can build a more equitable one, and one that is better, just a better framework for the world that we live in. So if you think about that, there are, again, it's a very interesting space at the moment. Multiple exchanges and CCPs are producing multiple interesting products. I mean, we could have a whole hour talking just about the kind of products that exchanges are bringing to market to solve some of these problems, just to help manage some of the risk that we find the loss of biodiversity brings. So with both of these, two examples, let me leave you there. But again, with all of this, I think as an industry, we're very conscious that we would like perhaps to have conversations earlier with our stakeholders. So, the likes of those of you around this table, if you come and speak to us earlier in the process, and I think that will enable everyone to have better outcomes.
Just continuing on there, I've heard the part about, I've had exchanges are brilliant at, innovation and innovating about how we can go about looking and solving these risks. And also we need to chat to you earlier. So looping back to a bit about the IFRS Foundation that people have been talking about, and the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which we've all heard will start with climate, but it won't stop there, and it intends to cover all sustainability topics, and that impact or pose a risk to enterprise value, and that will include biodiversity. So how important is it for investors to see numbers in the back end of the report attached to, related to biodiversity concerns, really getting these into the financial statements? Is that important for investors, do you think?
It's incredibly important. I would say it's almost the most important thing. We need to see numbers. We need to be able to take decisions. We need on fact and on data. And I think that the more and better data we have, and the more numbers we can channel, if you like, the more convincing the arguments become. So I think if you look at the role of the IFRS board, and I'll come to that a little more in future, I think they've started with the climate first approach. They will, I'm sure, move, especially with you moving inside into the board. There will, I'm sure, be a strong focus on biodiversity, but it's a difficult role that you and the IFRS Foundation have. It's much harder to put a price on nature. So I'm interested, to see the kind of data, to see the kind of numbers that we can come forward with, because I think putting a price on things is an easy way to encapsulate some of the issues. So numbers, I think, always illustrate what we are talking about, and the importance, the vital imperative of what we're doing. I think if you look for example, if you look at the Carbon Trackers report, you know, on the absence of climate risk in financial reporting, I mean, it's a good example of the kind of thing that we can, as you know, that is valuable for the industry. So in terms of lessons to take away for biodiversity related disclosure, it isn't just, you know, reporting in the financials that people want to see, that investors want to see. You know, investors want assurance that the claims that companies are making are credible. And that's something our members say to us time and time again. I mean, every year when we look at our sustainability survey, verification and assurance moves higher and higher on the priority list. So, you know, another role there, the number is important. So I think when we look to the long term, I think it's important to be able to put price on the value of nature. It sounds crude, but it's the best way really to demonstrate, you know, how and what, you know, we should be doing. And I also think that when you have data, when you have numbers, etc., it helps illustrate the arguments you're making, you know, around stewardship, you know, around governance, around changing, you know, corporate behavior. So if there's one thing that our members have said as well, you know, consistently for the last decade, and exchanges are on the front line of implementation. They have lived, you know, every story that there is in disclosure and in reporting. There's one thing our members have said to us consistently for the last decade, it is that there is so much, for lack of a better word, of market fragmentation. You know, there are so many different standards. We need a convergence. So with the IFRS, we hope that there will be convergence. It's not taken for granted. Large parts of the world don't use IFRS. And I think really here, you know, having those numbers will make the case.
Thank you, Nandini. Mark, I'm going to come to you next. So we talked, there was a bit about that, about valuation and methodologies. However, I just want to reflect back on something you said earlier when you had 20 people in a room for 2000. I remember those days. I remember those days where we'd be just delighted if 5 people showed up to listen to us speak about materiality or boundaries or try and help us work through those issues. And now we get thousands and thousands afterwards that are asking us more and more questions. So it does show there's been a huge shift, and perseverance pays off. So thank you for that. And thank you for persevering as well as part of this movement. So we've heard a bit about valuation, and how does the Capital's lens guide valuation methodologies and integrate biodiversity into wider business concerns?
Brilliant. And I think I just want to delve a little bit more into that price question, because actually there's a lot of misconceptions around this, that actually just putting a price on it is going to solve it. I don't think that's actually going to work. And I think what we're really talking about, and I think if we can delve down a bit more into that, is about just understanding that value. Now that value, putting that into monetary terms is extremely helpful, but price, cost, monetary value, they're all slightly different approaches to it. So we've got to be careful when we're calling for prices there, that actually that's different to costing, that's different to another form of valuation. You can have quantified valuation, particularly around biodiversity. It's about getting better context, better information. That's what we need to be able to inform the decisions, and getting the right information in the right format. So definitely if you're doing CapEx decisions, if you're doing investments, you want to see it in a monetary valuation format, definitely for that. There's other things where actually the notes and other sections can really help to bring out that picture. You may not be able to get it into a monetary value, you may be able to get a quantified value that will be able to do it. You may be able to get something there that can really drive it. So pushing for just that price, I think we've got a lot of conversations in our community at the moment, and definitely not pushing back on the exchanges there. I think it's really important we do that, but we've got to put it into context of what we mean by value, the relative importance and worth. And there is work going on at the moment. The Transparent and Aligned projects are both looking to actually identify those values in consistent ways, robust ways that provide, and this is the key thing here, most of the information, the conceptual framework from IFRS requires useful and relevant information. When you look at most of the sustainability information that's released, it's numbers. It's raw data. It's 1,000 of this, 1,000 of that. I've done this in this context. What it isn't doing is it isn't providing the broader context. It isn't providing the benefit to society. It isn't providing the benefit to the business. That's what value can get us to. If we can get it to that, we also know who has been impacted, who benefits, who pays the costs for these things. If we can get it to that, then that information does become useful and it becomes relevant and it fulfills the requirements of the IFRS conceptual framework. I would suggest at the moment, most of the information does not. That's going to be the challenge in this next period of time, really moving to understand value and price, costs, and all those bits of types of value, but really understanding that value to inform better decisions.
If I could just come in, Marty, I wanted to say, Mark, we actually, as an industry, don't have any argument with that, and welcome a further conversation on some of those things.
Great, and like I say, it's these sort of conversations that can help us to get to that point. So I'd love to pick that up with you.
And I think there is a lot of great work that is going on in this space, and these are all very complementary activities, and and we've just got to keep them all going at the same pace, so they all sort of come into the one position at the time together, so they are all really, really useful, and we can all run with them at the same time. So speaking of running with them, I'm going to now ask my colleagues Francesca and Laura to run us through the guidance. Please pop all your questions in the chat. I see we've got one already, and we'll come to them straight after Laura and Francesca run us through the new biodiversity application guidance. Over to you, ladies.
Just like to say thank you for our speakers. That was really interesting. We heard a lot of useful aspects about biodiversity that underline the importance of it, and of biodiversity management, and of the need for comprehensive and effective biodiversity disclosures. So with that, myself and Francesca will give a quick overview of the guidance that is launched today. So the aim of the guidance is to assist report preparers in the disclosure of material biodiversity related information to investors via the mainstream report. As we know, the reporting environment is evolving rapidly. This guidance therefore supports companies in meeting the current investor and market-driven demands, as well as preparing for new regulations that may come into place. It's also useful for forward-thinking companies that want to be first movers within this space. The application guidance is designed to go along with the CDSB framework. And for those that don't know, the CDSB framework contains 7 guiding principles and 12 reporting requirements. The biodiversity application guidance tackles the first 6 of these content-specific guidance requirements that we will go through later in more detail. So as you mentioned a few times, that there's a lot of signposting throughout the guidance, and that's because we tried to take a very collaborative approach to it. So this starts with the formation of a working group of around 50 experts in various fields, and this includes NGOs, regulators, corporations, and investors. They've been engaged throughout the process, including reviewing the document and having debates on technical points. We also had a public consultation in September where we've received a lot of feedback and engaged well with the community. We aim for the guidance to be as aligned as possible with other materials in the market. So we therefore conducted a thorough literature review before writing the guidance and referenced and signposted to this as much as possible. So this slide shows just some of the resources we drew from in the preparation of the guidance. It includes various frameworks, standards, research papers, and tools. We're going to move on now into the content of the guidance and a brief overview of that. So the initial part of the guidance outlines some key characteristics that should be considered when organisations prepare their biodiversity disclosures, and these are embedded throughout the guidance into the different requirements. I'll just run through a couple of these to give some examples. So first of all, there's the spatial dimension, and this is the fact that biodiversity is very location specific and that business impacts can have a wide geographical reach. There's also the time dimension, the fact that impacts and dependencies vary with the natural dynamics within and across years. And this could be, for example, due to seasonality or species migration. Biodiversity is also thoroughly interconnected with other natural capital changes. For example, it shares impact drivers with impact drivers such as land use change or pollution are shared with other environmental issues such as climate change and water degradation. And therefore you need to consider these aspects holistically instead of focusing on them each individually and not considering the different synergies and trade-offs that may occur. In addition, due to the shared nature of biodiversity as a resource, it's necessary to engage and collaborate with external stakeholders. Business impacts of biodiversity have also often found outside the organisation's direct operations, and this makes it really important to consider the value chain and the biodiversity management and different policies and strategies and targets that should be contained related to the value chain. I'm going to pass over to Francesca now to run through some more of the content.
Thanks, Laura. So in terms of reporting areas, the scope of the guidance cover these 6 reporting areas. So from governance to management of policy strategies and targets, risks and opportunities, metrics and performance and future outlook. And what we basically did in developing this guidance was to integrate the key characteristics of biodiversity that Laura just presented into these 6 reporting areas. For example, on governance, besides focusing on boards and management, we focus on like we provide suggestion on how to engage with stakeholders along the value chain and in areas that are hotspots, let's say, for biodiversity. And so it's for the other areas, reporting areas. Okay. And for each of these 6 reporting areas, what the guidance provides is a disclosure checklist. So some questions that like guide the preparation of disclosures and also the analysis on potential gaps and future steps that the company have to take in the journey of disclosing biodiversity and integrating it into mainstream reports. Besides the disclosure checklist, we provide detailed reporting suggestions and guidance specific on biodiversity. And for each of these 6 reporting areas, we provide reference to useful external resources that were already mentioned before by other speakers and by Laura, and example of practice from corporate mainstream report. That, like, for biodiversity was a kind of a hard task because it's still emerging areas, like especially compared to climate, but we try to provide like good examples that are already out there. And beside these elements, we also provide in the guidance some figures and tables that really support the report preparers. So the first one is like the one on the right that we called Roadmap to Effective Disclosure. So basically, these figures illustrate a logic and potential pathway in the preparation of biodiversity disclosure that are effective. And of course, biodiversity related disclosure for mainstream report. And it also shed a bit of light between the internal processes and management that have to be taken to tackle biodiversity, and then the preparation of disclosures. And the other resource that it's on the left is this mapping table that basically maps the CDSB reporting areas or requirements with other existing reporting standards and framework that covers elements of biodiversity and TCFD, of course. I hand back over to Laura.
Thank you. We also have boxes that contain deep dive information on various elements and important concepts to understand. Some of these were discussed with the working groups in deep dive debates where we discuss like the correct definitions of stuff and the best way to put it into the report. Just a couple of examples of what is included. We have a box that explains water ecosystem services, and this includes explanations of the different definitions and grouping systems. This was particularly useful because it's quite a complex market that is rapidly evolving. So having a map showing what the different definitions are and how they're used by different people is quite helpful. We also have explanations of the business drivers of biodiversity loss, and this includes how they relate to influencing trends such as economic and technological trends, and also the different changes to the state of nature that can arise, such as the loss of ecosystem extent and condition. And some of these business drivers of biodiversity loss are also shared with climate change. So that's another link to how it's shared environmental issues. Another one we have is the explanation of assessment approaches, including primarily the impacts pathway approach from the Capitals Coalition, which assesses how, as a result of a specific business activity, an impact driver results in changes to biodiversity and how this affects stakeholders. We also have various useful examples throughout the report. So for example, we have a table of management responses, and we categorize them into value chain positions and also mitigation hierarchy categories. We also have a table of the various biodiversity risks and opportunities, and these have been categorized into the same categories that are used with DCFD to make sure they're aligned. We've also noted whether the risk relates to biodiversity loss itself or the ecosystem service underpins to help to understand how they relate to each other and how biodiversity supports the ecosystem services. And finally, we have examples of the biodiversity indicators and metrics that could be used. As mentioned, this is a very rapidly evolving market. But we've got the current ones that are available, and we've split them into the different impacts pathway categories to show how they can be used throughout the process. I'll hand back to Francesca.
So just last comments before closing. So this guidance is, yes, specific, and I also saw a related question popping up into the chat. So this guidance is specific for biodiversity, but we should not be used in isolation. So we are well aware that biodiversity is interconnected with other environmental and also social aspects and topics. So what we try to do in the guidance is to make links with other, again, environmental topics and issues, as well as social. And yeah, that's like, it's to again underline the importance on addressing these topics, not in silos, but all together. And so just one last slide from our side. So besides, so after this launch, of today launch, we are continuing the dissemination of the guidance and biodiversity related disclosures. So we have a couple of events. So in 2 days, so December 2nd, we have a practical workshop for companies, and you can go on our website and register for it. And on December 7th, we have an event for policymakers. But in terms of material, beside the guidance itself, so document, we will release in a couple of weeks an e-learning course on biodiversity related disclosure on the TCFD Knowledge Hub. That is very useful to get an introduction to this topic. And at the beginning of next year, we will also release translations of the biodiversity guidance into Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So that's all from our side, and I will hand back over to Marty.
Thank you very much, Francesca and Laura. It certainly is, there's a lot in the document. When I read it recently, I was like, goodness, you guys have pulled an awful lot together. And I did join some of the robust conversations you had with the subgroups and working groups. And, you know, and I'm sure Mark can attest to this, and all the guidance that Dini's developed over the years. These things with lots of different stakeholders and lots of different opinions at such early stages, and never easy to pull together. So a huge well done from me, Francesca and Laura, for all your hard work in pulling that off and getting this guidance out. It really will make a difference. So I have one last question for our panelists. So if a preparer wants to get started, what do they do next from your stakeholder perspective? Mark, Nandini, and then I'm going to throw it to Ravi.
Oof. So how do you get started? Well, I think that there is an awful lot of documents and things you can get out there. The best thing, though, to do is to look at an example. So, and we found this again and again and again, and we can write these wonderful guidance documents. People don't go to them first. What they do is they go in through a case study, an example, they talk to a friend, maybe hopefully over a coffee in real life, and you get something like that, then you go to the guidance. So don't go jumping into the guidance if you're beginning. Start to think about, actually, what does this really mean to me, and get an example. That's the best way.
And that very much speaks to what we tried to do in this guidance, because the question is, how do I do it and what does it look like? And it really is those what does it look like that shifts the bar, you know, and you know, so for those of you out there that are thinking, do I get started? Absolutely get started. No one is checking you, no one is coming from behind. People are just admiring the fact that you actually gave it a shot. I think that's, you know, this is a really new emerging world, and we do have to work together to get started. And Dini, what's your take? How do you get started?
Well, I would say that I thought Mark made really good points, and I think that the guidance itself was interesting and well written. And may I, since I am, you know, have both of you here, Laura, you know, and Francesca, well done and congratulations. You know, it was eloquent, well crafted, well written, interesting to read. Those are great. That's a great starting point. In addition to what I thought Mark said, really intelligent things, you know, look at examples, you know, think about it, etc. I would say, you know, go and speak to your friendly exchange, because they will have a wealth of practical experience as to how to get started, and they'll be happy to support you as an issuer, especially in that journey.
Off to your exchange, everyone. Ravi.
Okay, on the spotlight now, and Mark and Nadini both mentioned some really important processes here. And within the actual application guidance itself, so we've gone through 6 reporting requirements. Under each and every one of those reporting requirements, we have best practices. So real life examples of what companies are doing now, and you can use that as a starting point, really building upon what Mark had mentioned.
Thank you, Ravi. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Mark and Nandini for joining us today. I thank you to my colleagues. Thank you very much for all your hard work. You are amazing. I'm privileged to get to work with you every single day of the week, and well done on your efforts. I'll be forever in awe of what you have achieved. And I think what we've heard across the 2 events today, and very much sort of where we're at now, is we need to get started. If you haven't started on this, you need in this journey. I'm thinking about biodiversity and what it means for your business, whether that be from an internal perspective or an external perspective. You need to get started. We all need to be courageous. We all need to learn and work together, experiment and do better. So thank you very much for joining us all today. It's been a real privilege to be able to chair this panel on such an important topic. Go online, download the guidance, get involved with the e-learning, have a look at Mark's work, talk to your exchange, and it's now up to you. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening or day.